The Woman Behind the Discovery of Climate Change. Project by Brianna Westlake. I'm sure many of you have heard of CO2 emissions warming the Earth. This phenomenon is discussed under the topic of climate change. Did you ever wonder where these discoveries came from? More specifically, who discovered them? When doing simple research, you will find a man named John Tyndall, who is credited for being the founder of climate change. But he was not the first to make this discovery. We have had it wrong all this time, because 3 years prior to his discovery, a woman, mother, wife, activist, and scientist from a small town made the discovery that CO2 emissions were going to warm the Earth. She made this discovery in 1856, and it was because of her gender that she did not have the power for her findings to be heard by the public. A woman named Eunice Newton Foote was born on July 17th in 1819 in Goshen, Connecticut. She moved to a small town called Bloomfield, New York, previously known as Holcomb, and lived in a small house on Goss Road in 1821 at the age of 2. This house is where she grew up, and the house still stands today, and it's abandoned. Eunice lived with her father, Isaac Newton Jr., her mother, Tirzah Newton, and her 11 siblings. She had 5 brothers and 6 sisters. She was number 11 amongst the children. Eunice grew up with some privilege amongst her family and was ultimately able to go to school, which was rare for women. She attended Troy Female Seminary that was later renamed the Emma Willard School. She was exposed to science in large amounts at school, and she stayed up to date on her own research in scientific literature. The school was the first institution for females in the United States, and it opened in 1821 with 90 students from across the country. One notable alumnus from the school was a women's rights activist named Elizabeth Stanton, who Eunice ended up working with later in her life. Eunice attended Troy Female Seminary from age 17 to 19, and she was classmates with Catherine Cady. In 1841, Eunice married Elijah Foote, who was a judge, inventor, and fellow scientist. They married in Bloomfield, but moved to Seneca Falls to get involved in the women's rights movement. They had 2 daughters, Mary and Augusta. Eunice was a young mother while working on her science experiments and predictions. She was an amateur scientist and made the discovery that CO2 emissions were going to warm the Earth with a simple experiment. The term scientist was not used at the time, so she was called a natural philosopher. She determined the effect thermal action had on rays of light proceeded from the sun. Eunice used an air pump and 2 cylindrical receivers that were about 1 inch in diameter and 30 inches in length. She placed 2 thermometers in the cylinders and put exhausted air in one and condensed air in the other. She acquired the same temperature in both cylinders and then placed them side by side in direct sunlight. The sun's rays rose the temperature to 110 degrees in the condensed air tube and 88 degrees in the exhausted air tube. It was also found by her experiment that the sun's rays have greater effect on moist air than dry air. Lastly, Eunice found that the highest effect of the sun's rays were observed to be in carbonic gas. She filled up 2 receivers, one with carbonic gas and the other with regular air. It was found that the receiver filled with carbonic gas heated very sensibly, and it also took a long time to cool compared to the other receiver. Eunice states in her findings, an atmosphere of that gas would give to our Earth a high temperature, and if, as some suppose, at one period of its history the air had mixed with it a larger proportion than at present, an increased temperature from its own action as well as from increased weight must have necessarily resulted. She heated different gases and found that hydrogen gas only heated up to 104 degrees, common air 106 degrees, oxygen 108 degrees, and carbonic gas 125 degrees. These findings show the significant effect that carbonic gas could have on temperature. Eunice attempted to publicize her findings. She went to the American Association on August 23rd, 1856, but she did not read her own work. She instead had a friend of hers, Joseph Henry, read it in efforts to limit bias among the men listening to her findings. She was worried that if she herself read it, that she wouldn't be taken seriously because of her gender. At the time, many men listening to these scientific discoveries would ignore women if they tried to present. The problem that arose while Joseph Henry was reading is that he failed to recognize the aspects of Eunice's work that were crucial to her findings. She had declared that, quote, an atmosphere of that gas would give to our Earth a high temperature, end quote. It might have been because of her gender, or possibly because of Henry's missteps, but her work was not seen as hers by the public. For a century and a half, climate change was said to be discovered by John Tyndall, who had made his discovery 3 years after Eunice made hers. In 2011, some spotlight was finally brought to Foote's findings by a geologist, but still today the credit is not fully given to her. There is a lot of questioning of whether Tyndall knew about Foote's findings. The concrete evidence of Tyndall seeing Foote's published paper is missing, but the suspicion is there. Tyndall had been on the editorial board of the philosophical magazine that had represented Eunice's husband Elijah's discoveries, that had been shown right next to Eunice's own piece published by the American Journal of Science and Arts. Someone on the same board as Tyndall had claimed to have seen Eunice's work, but obviously they did not publish it. It is said that it is unlikely for Tyndall to have read her paper. If he had seen it, it is likely that he had seen her gender and skipped over it because she was a woman. Foote's last paper that she published was in 1857, and after she was done with science, she worked on campaigning for women's suffrage alongside Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Both Elijah and Eunice worked to help Frederick Douglass escape slavery as well. Throughout her life, Eunice made many accomplishments, some of which she was never credited for. She discovered CO2 emissions would warm the earth. She played a big role in women's suffrage, and she helped slaves escape slavery. She also patented 3 inventions. She was also very involved in helping her husband with his work. Eunice paved the way for a lot of women in science. Sadly, there are women in science today that are still experiencing discrimination. Eunice died at age 69 on September 30th, 1888 from chronic illness. It should be noted and spoken out more that Eunice made a huge impact on the discovery of climate change, and she deserves far more credit than she receives. The purpose of this project was not only to give credit to a deserving woman and explain her accomplishments in life, but also to show the public history that is right outside our door. I myself am from Bloomfield, New York, and I never knew that such an influential scientist lived down the street from where my childhood home is. I recommend you look at what local history is right outside your door, because you might find something very interesting and influential.